All right. I think we're ready to start. So it looks like we've got everyone's let in, and just want to invite everybody again to the last session of the AO Spine North America Virtual BAMF Fellows Forum of 2020. This is the COVID version. I do want to thank all the fellows and participants for being on the line, and Greg Mundis for being here. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping options. So for the BAMF Fellows Forum winners, winner of the Best Clinical Abstract Award, it goes to Robert Owen from the University of Utah, who gave his presentation on preoperative regional erector spinae plane blocks. The winner of the Best Basic Science Abstract Award goes to Mina Aziz from McGill on the nanoparticle functionalized polymethyl methacrylate bone cement for sustained chemotherapeutic delivery, which is a mouthful. And then the winner of the Best Oral Poster Presentation goes to Mohammed Karim from University of British Columbia, looking at the efficacy of cervical decompression in patients with cervical spondylitic myelopathy. And so congratulations to all those winners. You will all receive an engraved plaque, invited to participate as faculty in the next March 2021 BAMF Fellows Forum, which presumably will be in person. I certainly hope it will be. I also want to just take just a second here to again talk about the DePuy Synthes Spine Clinical Relations team. They will reach out to all of the fellows to help us partner with the AAO as a liaison. And so they're incredibly helpful, and they're going to follow up with the fellows directly to see if they can help you with additional resources next year and beyond as you start your clinical practice. So thank you again to DePuy Synthes, and we will see those emails shortly. The Zoom etiquette, obviously all your microphones have been muted, and please send in questions in the Q&A button or click the raise your hand button so we can promote the panel. And then, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Greg Mundis. So who's going to talk about Surgeon Know Thyself, and Greg is from San Diego Spine Foundation. And a little bit about Greg. So Greg and I have gotten to know each other through the years, I think at various meetings and through friendships. And he invited me to be part of the GSO, and I came with him to Calais, Colombia, where we were able to operate together and did some amazingly complex cases and helped me know myself. Greg is married to his beautiful wife, Leslie. He is fond of cannolis, which he can find apparently in any city, regardless of how difficult they are. He has 4 beautiful children that he talks about constantly, and I know ground him and who he is. He's also an incredibly accomplished surgeon and person, and I'm certainly very happy to know Greg as a good friend. And so without further ado, Greg, please take it away and help us know thyself.
All right, well, thank you so much, Eric. I'm going to share my screen as soon as I'm allowed to, I think. We may have to get out of that one. All right. Good, and I hope everyone can see this all right. Well, first of all, so honored to actually be a part of this this group. It's been a goal of ours since we, since I graduated from my fellowship and stayed on in San Diego, was to be more integrated with the AO. And this is our first year where we get to claim that our fellows are AO fellows, and we are thrilled to death to be a part of this family, and certainly hope that we will be able to continue to contribute and to provide value to the AO in the years to come. Also, thank you so much for allowing me to talk on a topic that's actually really near and dear to my heart, and something that I've found tremendous joy and value in, and hopefully can share that with you guys. So it's a lot of writing, but really the only thing that matters here is that we are now AO fellowship supported, which is awesome. Since giving an AO talk, I suppose that's a conflict. And then I do sit on the global outreach board and then the CEO of that organization, so there'll be some conflict there. this is kind of what we're going to do. We're going to talk a little bit about me for a few minutes. When I say we, I actually mean I'm going to talk about me for a few minutes, and because it's really relevant to this topic, because you need to know where I'm coming from to make any sense of this talk. Just like you guys are all going to have to individually understand where you're coming from to understand yourselves better. I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of our training, and as we're talking to predominantly fellows today, I think I want to talk a bit about how we are trained. I want to identify some of the problems that may happen from conditioning and reinforcement in our training, and then work towards some solutions that have worked for me in my life, and then leave some time for discussion. So if you guys want, you can screenshot this or take a picture with your phone. Please don't etch it into the wall of any toilets and places like that. But this is a talk that's fairly fresh. So I always love feedback to understand what I can do better for this talk. So hopefully everyone can see this video. But this video really describes this whole talk. There's the guy on the left who's super flashy, crowd pleaser, looking to make everyone happy around him. The guy on the right is a little bit more a man that has probably a better understanding of who he is, what his talents are, what his skill set is, what he can accomplish. You know, you'll see here in a second, when you know yourself and you know your own skill sets a little bit better, the result is a little bit more predictable. So it may not be the flashiest thing, but it's certainly effective if you can get to a place where you understand who you are. So I was born in Springfield, Missouri in 1977, and I grew up in Austria, where I lived for about 16 years until I graduated from high school there. I then subsequently moved to Missouri for undergrad. I kind of had an inkling about my junior year in high school that I wanted to go into medicine. I spent 4 years in Missouri, and understanding that it's difficult to get into medical school, particularly coming from a smaller liberal arts school, I decided to get my EMT license. I became a phlebotomist. I became an orthotech, and I worked pretty much a full-time job starting halfway through my freshman year, understanding all the while that I wanted to become a physician. I then got into the University of Missouri-Columbia, where I got to spend 4 years there. While I was there, right before I got married to my lovely bride, Leslie, who halfway through med school decided to also become a PA. That was actually, she had to move away for that, which kind of sucked. But I got I used my EMT license in med school as well to work. So I worked all through med school. And then I also worked as in the procurement bank to harvest eyes. It was a good job. I worked nights and weekends, all the while knowing that I had to work hard, try to keep my loans to a minimum, and hopefully be able to get into a career in orthopedic surgery. So I eventually matched at the Oklahoma University Health Sciences Center. It was my first choice there, and got to spend an amazing time there. We did a ton of cases. I did a lot of deformity surgery. They were super active, and they really loved their residents being engaged, and I was certainly really interested in it. I was really interested in academics, but the system wasn't set up for it. And so in 5 years, I only published 2 papers, one in like the journal of Nepali radiology, and the other one in some other esoteric journal. Only one of them in orthopedics. My wife continued to work as a PA full time. We ended up having 3 kids during residency. It was amazing. But you can see the added stressors of that, as many of you guys are experiencing even now. I ended up getting to do my fellowship with Dr. Akbarnia in 2008, 2009. And during that time, I was able to publish a little bit more, write a little bit more. And it was really a reconstructive fellowship that focused predominantly on adult and pediatric deformity. And then in December of my fellowship, Dr. Akbarni offered me a job, and obviously I couldn't refuse. During my fellowship year, it was also the first year that the ISSG was formulated formally as a 501c3, and so I got to join there. And I was also part of the last class in 2008 where fellows got to actually become, got to apply as candidate fellows for the Scoliosis Research Society. So it was a great fellowship year. I worked my tail off. So I joined Dr. Akbarnia's practice, and it was a true private practice. We spent 3 years. I spent, it was a 3-man group. I spent 5 years there. I was taking about 15 days of spine call per month. We did a ton of HMO work because of the landscape of our healthcare environment here in San Diego is extremely HMO based. I got to have a 4th baby during that time frame. And then for 18 months, we actually had my wife's sister and her family living with us. They had 3 teenagers at that time. And because of life circumstances, they spent some time with us and lived in our home. I was trying to launch a deformity career clinically, an MIS deformity and EOS, early onset scoliosis career academically. I got to lead the MIS for the ISSG for about 5 years, starting in 2013, and then got to publish a bunch. Got to speak a lot more. Dr. Akbarnia was a true mentor in providing me with opportunities and helping me launch a career in academic medicine. And the fall of 2014, we ended up joining the Scripps Clinic here in San Diego. So it wasn't so much moving practices as much as we merged practices. That was for numerous different reasons that we can talk about at some point. But I went from a pure private practice group to now a very large multi-specialty group practice where we, I think currently have like 800 or 900 physicians as part of the practice. Our orthopedic department had about 24 when I joined, and we're now in the mid-30s. We had a fantastic research infrastructure and had some rock star partners that were there as well. And my partners at the San Diego Center for Spinal Disorders also moved over to the Scripps Clinic at that time. A few years ago, about 2016, I started becoming more active in outreach and in a more organized way. I had done trips every single year, really since med school, trying to serve in one way or another overseas. And in 2016, I ran into Tony Ranella, and we started doing trips to Mexico and eventually Colombia. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And in 2018, in the fall, I took over as the CEO of the organization as the organization was heading towards a not so great place financially. And we were able to have a great turnaround, and we're on a phenomenal trajectory now, thank God. And started kind of getting our academic heads screwed on straight. So we're starting to publish more with this organization. And we've seen a bunch of kids in consultation and done a lot of surgery here the last 6 years. So it's been a great ride for GSO. I also serve as the vice president for the San Diego Spine Foundation, where we try to build bridges in our spine community and doing some collaborative research, but a lot of education in our environment here. And then it's also the home of our fellowship. So that's kind of where our academic appointment lies. I do a bunch of stuff with industry just because it's fun. But the main thing is trying to promote and develop relevant technology and figure out responsible and viable financial models that I'm really passionate about. And then finally, I serve on the board of our church. So the point of all this is that as you guys will see, as you get further along in your career and you're out in practice, things will constantly be added to your plate. And you will always have to make this decision of, I'm going to allow the addition into my life, or I'm not. For the longest time, and I'm out 10 years now, so probably for 8 or 9 of those years, I was very much a yes man. And I kind of just said yes to whatever, despite the collateral damage that may happen from that. And to understand that piece of it, the reason I wanted to just give you kind of a context of where I'm at right now is because it's not going to be dissimilar at all from where you guys are going to be in 5 to 10 years. And I say that because you may be involved in different things, but I guarantee you, like, because of your stature in your community, because of what you do, because of your position in the hospital or in your group, as you become more senior, you become more and more engaged in all these things around you, and your ability to absorb more volume of work actually increases. But it's all based on the context of our surgical training, in my opinion. So I'm going to share with you guys a little bit about our training and what that means. And I think it's important to know the history behind why you are trained the way you are, and perhaps maybe what some of the downsides are of our type of training, that may help you understand yourself better in the years to come, because it certainly has taken me a long time to understand why I react the way I do. Why do I respond to my wife the way I do sometimes? Why am I angry at my beautiful little kids sometimes? And I think a lot of introspection, reflection on my life's choices have led me to believe that so much of what I do is a conditioned response, and we're going to talk a bit about that. So this talk is like completely different than like what you're used to seeing, so I apologize if I bore you to death. Feel free to log off or walk away. But I hope that I can keep you guys engaged, because it's just a little bit different. And I certainly hope, as you guys are all getting forward to a career in spine surgery, that maybe a few of these words will ring true with you and your spouses and your families in the years to come. And if I can help you guys avoid some of the mistakes that I've made, that would be totally worth even the mistakes that I have made. So, so without further ado, so this all stems back to the Hippocratic Oath. So to hold the one who has taught me this art as equal to my parents and to live my life in partnership with him. That is what the Hippocratic Oath says about the person that is teaching you, your mentor. And you're going to hear me talk about mentorship a ton today, and because it is incredibly important in your career and in your life. And it is definitely part of this process of getting to know yourself. So Dr. Ekbarnia is 100% my senior mentor. This guy is amazing. He is literally turned into my academic dad for that, or really my spine surgery dad. And that's a huge role to fill. And he not only fills that role, he owns it. And to be able to be an individual like that, that gets it the way he does is pretty amazing. I also get to have partners like Dr. Eastlak, who is my contemporary. He's a few years older than me, but certainly is an individual that mentors me along the way and pushes me hard. Having guys like that speak life into you and are able to show you a better way and guide you and lead you is critical to have in your practice. So I have these two guys that are really, when it comes to spine surgery and sometimes to broader life, very, very important for me. So mentorship has more become this second definition, a period of time during which a person receives guidance from a mentor. And that statement really sort of encompasses what our residencies have really turned into. So we know that mentorship actually is not foreign even in our literature. It's been a way to coaching out of burnout, how you make decisions when things are unclear. And there's been a decent amount of literature written on mentoring the modern surgeon here in the 21st century. There's also some studies that have come out looking at residents and what they're going through. And this is one looking at some orthopedic residents, 243 of them, 96% showed that they actually believed that mentorship played an important role in their development as an orthopedic resident. And only about 2/3 of the residents convey that their program actually had a formal training program. Minorities, they were more likely to have a mentor, but more likely to be dissatisfied with them. And then females were a little more likely to pursue a mentor on their own. 31% of orthopedic residents are classified as experiencing burnout. That's about 1 in 3, so that's huge. About 70% describe depression symptoms. So whether we like it or not, at some point, these feelings will highly likely be a part of who we are, whether it's now or in the future. There also was no difference in the prevalence of mentorship and respondents experiencing burnout, and they were more likely to be unsatisfied with the quality of the mentorship in residency, and that's looking at the minority groups. 2/3 of residency programs, again, have mentorship programs, and so even despite almost all of them believing that they should have them. So where does this concept of mentorship come from? Well, the word itself means one who thinks, and there's a feminine and a male version for that. The first time that we really talk about this concept of mentor is actually back from Homer's Odyssey, where mentor was actually an individual who was assigned to educate Odysseus' son Telemachus while Odysseus was fighting the Trojan Wars. He's gone for 20 years. He said, "Mentor, I need you to educate my offspring," basically. Ironically, the first mentor that we really have to look back on actually failed at his job, which is kind of funny. because Athena had to step in. She basically dressed up as mentor and then did all the educating on her own. So it's kind of funny that the first mentor failed. So just realize if you're involved in a mentor or mentee relationship, it's okay to fail once in a while. You can always reference Homer's Odyssey to give it some context. So as medicine would go on, we all know surgery really is a bit more of a modern day practice, right? So surgery was not something that was performed routinely in the 15th century. And as we became more sophisticated with our medicine, so the surgical field started to become a reality. And certainly in the 19th century, where surgery really started happening more, the model for training was really between a mentor and a mentee, the master and the pupil. And they would have a relationship that would sometimes span a career, sometimes would span just a certain number of time, 5 years, 10 years, however long it was. But it was predominantly a one-to-one relationship. William Halsted is accredited later for introducing the concept of a surgical residency, where this apprenticeship model of being one-to-one was challenged. And he said, why don't we try to educate our residents with more than one trainer? And so they found trainees that would dedicate 5 or more years of their life to learn the skill of surgery, to learn the art of medicine. They would do research under the guidance of whether it's their tutors or faculty or attendings. And they would spend their time really just completely entrenched in this world of medicine. And they called that the Socratic methodology of learning, which is basically the foundation to what we do even here now, 100 years later. And it's what happens in the US as well as worldwide. Probably one of the most famous mentor-mentee relationships that we have is between William Osler and Harvey Cushing. And for those of you that are neurosurgeons here, you'll obviously have Harvey Cushing ring really true to you, as he's the founder of neurosurgery. But interestingly enough, he was also a mentee of William Halsted. So the legacy that exists even in our specialty within spine dates way back to the time when William Halsted introduced the Socratic methodology. So this methodology of training is super rich in history, right? It's been how things have happened for years and years. Little has changed, and in some ways, maybe a little bit more concerning, the standardization in our training, expectations of our faculty and trainees hasn't really unified at all. And ultimately, the current state of our training is still resident versus attending. The problem now is, instead of having deep, meaningful relationships where these mentorship relationships really get to mature, we now have multiple attendings that are pouring into our lives. We have some standardization with written exams, some oral exams. That's how we get board certified. But no one's really critically, actively looking at our surgical skill, which is technically what we do. So mentorship is really important. And even though we've moved away from this one-to-one training, I do believe that it carries a very, very important role in our field. And to the point where now it seems that we're training more on a 5-to-1 or even a 30-1 ratio. So there's a lot of programs that even have more than 30 attending. So it's sometimes difficult to really have a productive and fruitful relationship with attendings when you're just not spending much time with them. So some of the challenges, I'd say, that the teaching methodology over the last 100 years hasn't changed, despite a very significant shift in the way we practice medicine now. There's been a huge change in university-based practices. There's been this incredible subspecialization, where spine surgery used to be specialized, and now we're even subspecializing spine surgery. There's a change in incentives. It used to be, whether it was academic or, financial, et cetera, it's really shifted now into more towards volume. There's been change in insurance reimbursement, where it's just not as good as it used to be. The government's not supporting our programs the way it used to. And there's this rapid change in technology, which is, I'll touch on later, but may actually be a bit of a detriment to our surgical training. And it seems now, and again, I'd love to hear from you guys if you feel this way, but as attendings, we tend to be focused a little bit different now. Instead of being focused on academic productivity, we're really focused on clinical productivity, because that's really how we're paid. That's how our bonuses come. We're focused more on volume because of that, because the amount that we're being paid per case is actually diminishing. So now there's this push towards being a lot more productive. There's also this reciprocal push towards an improved quality of life, which is interesting. So people are really looking to have an improved quality of life. And I know that surgeons that are graduating from fellowships now are definitely becoming more and more in tune with this part of themselves, which I think is to a certain degree very healthy. Again, the rapid change in technology and techniques can sometimes make the hands-on experience a little bit less meaningful. And with all these device manufacturers out there, the conflict of interest that exists among us as surgeons is real. And what I mean by that is if I'm going to design a new implant, I got to make for darn sure that it works. Or if I'm just helping design a new technique, I want to make sure that it's being executed appropriately, which means I'm probably going to want to be more hands-on as we're trying to develop and launch and evaluate these materials, these implants, et cetera. And so the result may be that there's a little less hands-on because of that. So here's the other thing that we're dealing with. The result of a lot of this training process, the way it currently is that there's actually a very much a loss of autonomy among trainees now. So you are not your own. And for the most part, people would agree with that statement. So there's not much regard for your particular individual learning style. You may not be someone that is motivated by negative comments or by being put down. You may be, but you may not be. You may be not someone that learns well by reading a book, and you need to have different ways of understanding the topics at hand, and whether it's video or whether it's reading material, etc. There seems to be a lack of respect for individual hobbies on the parts of residents and fellows because your time is limited with your training, and it's really felt that you should be wholeheartedly immersed into this process. I still talk to a lot of our fellows on their work hours and how that works out. It's not uncommon to hear that these work hours are not always perfectly at 80 hours. And to that point, there's usually very little empathy towards families. And by what I mean by that is not that we don't care about your families. It's not something that we're actively trying to help you manage. We're typically actively trying to manage our practices and getting the work done. Decision-making is only a partial responsibility for you now. So there's so much oversight anymore that you're really never truly accountable for decision-making, and that can be a problem in the long run. There's also this massive financial discrepancy in income versus time spent on the job for most residents. You know, most of us in residency are making anywhere in the order of $6 to $10 an hour. And that's as a board eligible medical doctor in the United States of America. In Australia, the residents, as they grow in their years out from training, they actually get paid a lot more. And the closer they get to being an attending, they actually make really decent attending salaries, which then just grow as they matriculate into a private practice model if they decide to go that way. There's also this dehumanization that's happening right now with a lot of these programs growing to be quite large. It's difficult. You're spending time with 2 or 3 attendings at a time, which means you never really get to know the patients that you're treating. And things become more about getting the job done, about rounding, about having the list be perfect, about the check boxes on the list, make sure that it's all the work's getting done. But I would challenge you, when are we getting taught about the humanity of our profession? We're dealing with human beings. We're dealing with souls. We're dealing with families. We're dealing with people that have real life situations that are completely and entirely affected by their pathology, which is leading them to come see us. And sometimes even the treatments that we then recommend, we have to really put those in context of the people that we're treating, because not every surgery is the same on every individual. It's very different doing a T10 to pelvis on a 74-year-old that lives independently with no one else around her versus the 74-year-old that has an insane amount of family support with her. And so all things are not created equal. So why do we go through all this training? Why do we put up with all these downsides? I mean, what's the deal? Is it even worth it? And the reality is that we are treating our patients with consented assault. Right? That's what surgery really ends up being. Like, we're literally using knives and bovies on other human beings. I mean, that is completely intense to me. And so I guess the point is, like, our responsibility is huge. You know, we're using screwdrivers and saws and mallets and osteotomes and gouges. Like, we're doing these things while we're working towards the spinal cord and towards nerve roots and the dura and all these structures that are eminently around us. So even though there's this tradition that we've always had, in some ways the Socratic method really has worked for us over time. But hopefully this little review kind of helped you guys understand your residencies a little bit better. We're going to transition a little bit now into this idea of conditioning. And so what I would charge you with is that we're becoming conditioned machines. So if you look in the psychology literature and the behavior literature, you'll find that it takes about 66 days or so for a behavior to become automatic. Now, many of you have read all kinds of different books. You may have heard of the concept of 21 days to developing a habit. It's actually a misnomer a little bit. It was always meant to be a minimum of. It was never meant to be that that's the actual number. And depending on the desired behavior pattern that you're trying to elicit and the frequency at which that you're able to try to create that pattern, the time intervals in between it will also dictate how long it takes for that behavior to take and how strong that behavior or response will actually be. And that just makes sense. So if it takes on average 66 days, let me put this in context for you guys in the setting of a training program where you're spending 1,825 days in a 5-year residency for your behavior to be a certain way for you to become a surgeon, okay? 66 days to create a habit. You guys are all doing over 2,000 days to become the surgeons that you currently are. 2,200 for a 6-year program, or if you're doing a 5-year with a fellowship, 2,500 in 7 years, and et cetera. And for those of you in neurosurgery, you got a lot of days that you're working on these automated behaviors. So what's the result? We're conditioned to depend on our attendings. We're conditioned to have supervision. We're conditioned that when we screw up, we should study harder. We should prove our worth by perhaps working more. We should do more, do better. And part of that is because we play a zero-sum game of like, complications are not acceptable. They just aren't, right? Spinal cord injuries, not acceptable. Nerve root lacerations, not acceptable, you know? And we all know this. And so the challenge is that there's this discrepancy between how we handle complications, how we handle our screw-ups, and then how we react to that. So the M&M process, I think, is a bit faulted because a lot of us still do M&M where we have to present our own complications in front of a room where you're kind of just getting publicly shamed. You're a bit humiliated by the fact that you made a dumb error, whether it's a misdiagnosis or hurting somebody, and frequently just feel like you're not treated very well in that process. So what happens to our conditioned responses? So here's one of the challenges that we're at some point not going to have to work 80 hours a week. At some point, you're going to have a different set of freedoms. At some point, you're going to become a parent, highly likely. And how much you trust this educational system ends up being how much you're going to apply the principles from the educational system into the other parts of your life. Now, mind you, there's 24 hours in a day, and many of us spend upwards of 16 to 18 hours a day working towards our professional goal, which leaves us with 6 to 8 hours a day of not doing that. And in that 6 to 8 hours, typically we're sleeping 6 of it at least, if not a little bit more. And so what I mean by this is all day long, you're being trained and conditioned, and you only have very small windows to have a life outside of that makes you a father, a loving husband, someone that takes care of those around him, of taking care of yourself. And these are the things that I think get skipped, and that's the problem. So operant conditioning is anything that increases the likelihood that a response is going to occur. And reinforcement is how that conditioned response is created, right? So conditioning, again, is you're looking for a desired response, and anything that increases the likelihood of that will be part of this conditioning process. I think understanding reinforcement and what that looks like in our world, in your own world right now, wherever you are, is really important, because it'll empower you to understand your own responses to different stimuli or stressors in your life as it relates to your wife, your husband, your kids, your friends, those around you that you love, your parents, et cetera, et cetera. There's positive reinforcement. And in that case, when you add something, you get a response, right? For instance, in residency, for us, it was if you got an abstract accepted to a meeting, then the department would pay room travel and boarding us. And so that was cool. If I do X, write a paper, I get, Y, which is the bonus for getting to go to the meeting. Negative response is basically removing something to increase the desired response. So this year, the American Board of Orthopedic Surgery said, you know what? Actually, it was last year. They said, you don't have to sit for your boards. You don't have to actually take a recertification exam. If you do these yearly exams called the WLA, which are online platforms where you read an article and answer questions about it, and as long as you get a certain number of responses correctly, you don't have to do the board exam. No brainer for me. Like, I have no desire to study anything besides spine for medicine, and so I don't want to have to spend a lot of time learning about hand surgery again, and adult recon, et cetera. So for me, this is a no-brainer to take this route. That's negative. That's a negative reinforcement. So the strength of the response then is measured by the persistence of the response, or the frequency of that response, the duration of the response, and then the accuracy of that response over time. There's two types of reinforcement. There's continuous and partial. Continuous is not, we're not spending much time on that one. It's really, continuous is like when you're training a dog. Every time it pees, you give it a cookie. Like it's a 1-to-1 ratio. That's continuous. Partial means that you break things up now. And so there's 4 different kinds. There's fixed ratio, interval, variable interval. So fixed ratio just says reinforcement occurs after a specific set of responses. So after every third paper published, I'm going to throw you a pizza party. Yay, it's awesome. Another way to do it is to do a fixed interval, which means the reinforcement occurs after a specific amount of time. So after each rotation, I take my resident fellow out for pizza and beer. That's the fixed interval. So you know that if you do a good job, you get this at the end of it. They don't create the strongest of responses because they're more predictable, because they're fixed. And so the response strength may not be as good in those two. Now, the variable ratio and variable interval is where you really see an improvement in the strength of the response. And these are the ones that stick over time. So for instance, me being trained 10 years ago, these are the responses from this type of training that I still trigger me even to this day. So our variable ratio then says reinforcement behavior occurs after an unpredictable number of responses. So after a random number of surgeries performed, the attending randomly compliments you on a job well done. The randomness of it makes you want to keep doing that because you are finally getting some positive feedback when you did something good, and it makes you want to just do more good. Variable interval says, as you would imagine, the reinforcement behavior occurs after unpredictable time intervals. So this would be like during surgery, the attending randomly allows you to do more than you expected, and he's telling you how impressed he is. And then the next operation, you go back to doing nothing again. You're like, what the heck? I don't get this. And for 2 or 3 operations, you may not do very much, and all of a sudden he'll let you do a bunch again. And that variable interval kind of keeps you on your toes and makes you want to study hard, know what you're doing, and always be ready for the opportunity. So there's a guy named Skinner, if you guys remember your basic psychology at all. This guy was kind of a cool guy, and he studied gamblers. And mind you, I am not a psychologist, and I'm not by any means an expert in this field. So if I screw this up, please forgive me. But I'm gonna keep it pretty superficial here. The bottom line was that there was a time when they were realizing in the world of casinos that if you would gamble, and if the gamblers lost too much money, the casinos would not make as much money because the gamblers were leaving. What they realized is they have to give them a little bit of their money back. So they would use these concepts of variable interval or the variable reinforcement methodologies, because they produced the strongest responses, which was more gambling. And so he investigated this a little bit further and found that these gamblers, and it was not universal by any means, but there was a tendency for them to have lower than normal levels of endorphins in a non-stimulated state, which was very similar to cocaine addicts who kept needing a bigger bump to get the same response. And so these gamblers not only showed practical signs of their addiction, but they also had some physiologic signs that went along with it. So you guys are probably thinking like, what the heck, dude? Like, you're way off tangent. But let me kind of bring it back down to our training. So at different levels of our training, we do things differently, and I'll still do these things even now. But when you're in training, you're really reliant on your attending to allow you to do something. So an example would be, you prepare as much as you can, you study your brains out, you do literature review on the topic that you're about to operate on, you go into Gray's Anatomy, actually learn the static anatomy, then you go read the surgical anatomy so that you understand how that works in space. Then you learn the surgical technique for the surgery that you're doing. Perhaps you do a virtual simulation if you can, perhaps you're watching videos online, and all that to do a carpal tunnel release for 5 minutes, right? Like, what the heck? And you're sitting there, and then you may or may not get to do the case. And that's the tough part, right? So the variable involvement from one procedure to the next actually leads you with the behavior pattern that can give you spikes of endorphins, that can give you spikes of energy, things that you really become super passionate about. So our behavior and perhaps our neurotransmitter levels and endorphin levels, maybe those are mimicking those of addicts as well, where we get kind of addicted, or we get drawn to these surges of whether it's a random compliment or whether it's the random ability to do an operation for the first time. And so we get a buzz from our job. And I don't know if you guys do at all, but I certainly get a buzz from my job all the time. I love my job. And so we're stimulated by this variable conditioning in our daily lives that we're really trained under for years and years, and that you continue to do even when you're out in practice. So imagine a scenario, right? Like, where we're doing this type of training for 5 to 8 years of our lives. Our responses are strengthening and changing over time. And early in our training, we may be content with just scrubbing. By the time we get into our fellowship, man, a lot of times you think like, I could do this whole C2 to pelvis, TVCR on my own, right? And you get so energized by the process from going from the simple to complex. And after a while, the desired conditioned response from our training can result in one of two things. It can actually result in resentment and anger and annoyance, and maybe it's fear of failure or unhealthy perceptions of your own qualifications. And a lot of that may be relate back to how we're trained and conditioned, and may also relate back to what our actual endorphin levels are, where they were very productive early on in our careers because they were stimulating us to work. But later on, these same endorphins can have negative effects as they may lead to more pathologic thoughts. So how's the story end for us? Well, I don't know yet, obviously. But we will, again, in review, spend 6 to 8 years as support staff. We work tirelessly. We spend our evenings and nights studying. We marginalize our personal lives with the excuse of having an ever important profession. We dehumanize our patients. We make very little money, and we expose our faults in front of our peers all the time. So how are we used to being rewarded? Backhanded compliments, getting to do more work, and because you did such a good job, here's some more. So maybe some positive feedback from our performance. And in general, so much of what we do is expected, right? You're expected to not have complications. You're expected to not react. You're expected to be a perfect surgeon because that's what all of our patients demand of us. But it has to be this way because it's literally our job. So what's crazy is overnight, you guys are going to regain your freedom. You're going to become the sole decision maker for your finances, your patients, who to operate on, what surgery to do, your time, how much time you spend at work. Your income goes up by tenfold. You put a 0 at the end of your income. It's insane. And all of a sudden, you are still this conditioned machine, basically, now with a whole different set of circumstances that are going to be required of you in life. And at this point, your responses are so strong and your habits so solidified that they're very difficult to break and certainly cannot be changed overnight. You can become burnt out from it, but a lot of time you're burnt out more on the educational process than you are on your job because you're also excited to go out into practice. But you may come to a point where you resent your work, you resent your patients, you resent anything that ends up taking your time. Nothing seems to have life around you, and it really can be a struggle. And then when complications happen later on when you're in practice, you no longer have the same mechanisms to deal with them. And perhaps more importantly, the complications that will come that really affect you won't maybe the surgical ones anymore. It may be financial turmoil in your practice, staff turnover, drama, insurance carriers dropping you. In your family, perhaps it's an accident, miscarriage, loss of a loved one, struggling marriage. It could be that you did something that hurt you politically and academically, and you don't know how to rebound from that, or you had a social media disaster. So our typical responses would be to bury ourselves in our work. We work more, we study more, allow ourselves to be more distracted, and we lean into the things that we know that we're good at, admitting that you suck, so you're working harder, again, longer, and trying to prove your self-worth. Because that is in some way how we've been conditioned over time. And that path, if you go down it or choose to go down it, ends up becoming very destructive. It results in broken marriages and broken relationships with your kids. You distance yourself from those around you and can ultimately lead to burnout. And we know this because if you look at the data, the incidence of burnout in our field is extremely high relative to what we think it ought to be. But the good news is this: it's not going to happen to you. And the reason is because you're going to be aware of these things. And these conditioned responses really don't have to define who you are. So the question of who am I, has been one that has perplexed me for several years now. This is my dad. So the reason I'm showing you a picture of this is certainly I am his son, and that is part of my identity. But this is my dad in the ICU in Springfield, Missouri, about 2 months ago. He spent 37 days on a ventilator. He had kidney failure from COVID, was in dialysis, had multiple DVTs, ended up getting fungemia, bacteremia, had 2 cytokine storms, developed acute ulcers, multiple bouts of pneumonia, UTIs, all of what you would expect. And there he is in the top right when he came home after being away from home for over 2 months. So this really has hit home for me these last several months because it's really made me take some time to evaluate myself. So quarantine for me was really spending time and trying to understand who I am, and perhaps how I need to live differently to gain control of that. So there's intrinsic and extrinsic methods of doing this, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you want to gain, as you look forward, you want to gain control of the environment that you can. You want to focus on safety when you're early out in your practice, and find reproducibility and eliminate variability. And these extrinsic factors, which I'm going to spend a little bit more time, which is understanding yourself, finding a mentor, be a mentee, create margin, spend time doing the things you love with the people that you value on activities that aren't necessarily just focused on yourself. So you have to understand your environment before you can really gain control of it. And so as you guys go out in your practices, it's really important that you understand all the variables that are there, some which are modifiable and others which are not. And you have to list these out and understand what they are. If you're in private practice, you have control over just about everything. It's a wonderful thing to have, but it can also be a tremendous burden. If you're in a group practice, you lose some of your autonomy, but you don't also have to deal with all the things you had to deal with in private practice, with all the financial control, the staff turnover, et cetera. But you'll lose some flexibility. And then in academic practices, a little bit more like a big group practice. But here even things have changed over time where productivity has become a stronger push rather than academia. Certainly you can speak to your academic colleagues to find out a little bit more from them how they feel about their current practices. So what you want to do is eliminate variability, and there's comfort and consistency, and you want to find that. So make going to work predictable, develop routines, own your own schedule, and so many pressures that you would normally have will literally go off you. So create culture around you, have fun with what you do. This is Halloween. But you want to create an environment that you enjoy, regardless of the practice type that you're in. It doesn't matter. Culture is not based on what you tell people, but how you treat them and the actions that you do, even on the work. So you have to do this in all respects of your job, clinically, academically, et cetera. When it comes to your surgical time, really spend a lot of time on being a safe surgeon. Complication avoidance is really, really important. Take your time, be a slow surgeon that's methodical, it's not making mistakes, and really develop a trusting relationship with your team around you. There are extrinsic factors as well. You want to understand yourself. Again, these are the things that we're going to talk about here. I love reading about these types of things. It's a personal hobby of mine. But perhaps the number one thing you can do to influence your job satisfaction is to spend more time getting to know yourself. And that means understanding your boundaries, know your limits, your passions, what irritates you, where your weaknesses are. And you have to reserve time to think. If you don't, life, I guarantee you, will just take over. And so this is a self-awareness chart. And you can kind of review this later on if you want, but it basically is it'll kind of let you know sort of where you are in this mix. You want to be in the top right. You want to be in this aware group where you know who you are, you know what you want to accomplish, you seek out and value other people's opinions. And this is really where leaders begin to realize their true benefits. So margin is the space that you have between your load and your limits. So if your load is totally full in life, and you're very close to your limit, then you will have no margin. When you exist in the space that there's no margin, there will be a lack of rest and exhaustion, which will end up suffocating your life. So you want to do something that is able to maintain margin in your world. It's not something that happens. And this is the challenge for you guys, is you actually have to fight for it. And the best time to fight for it, honestly, is day one of your practice, where you build it into your daily and weekly and monthly and yearly routine. I found myself several years ago creating a template of what this actually would look like for me. I found the themes in my life and realized that schedules are important. And then once you kind of figure out the core piece, then you can fill around the edges. You can tweak it and fine tune it. But you got to find out those things in life that are an absolutely essential part of your life. And the rest of it can go that way. This is just kind of what I did several years ago, saying, in my ideal world, this is what my schedule would look like. And that was 4 years ago. And I'm happy to say it actually looks better than that now, where I'm actually taking every Friday off. Spend time doing the things you love. This is maybe with my boys at Game 6 of the World Series a couple of years ago, where the Sox won. But explore those areas of your life that you enjoy, whether it's athletics, hobbies, family life. But you have to incorporate these things into your week, into your day. I would even challenge you for that. And then spend time with the people that you value. Make sure that you are spending time at home and that you're doing so without being distracted. You don't want to waste your time and energy on things that don't matter. And the reality is, this little bubble right there, that don't waste your time or energy on things that don't matter, I'm telling you, is probably the hardest thing for us to do as surgeons, because there's so much that happens around us. Life is about relationships, so we have to make those moments count. And I certainly appreciate being with so many of my friends over the years that I've really got to enjoy. I'm going to blow through this a little bit. There's different types of relationships that exist in this mentorship model. I think they're all important, and you'll need to find different surgeons and mentors that will fill these different roles as a tutor, as a coach, a role model, and a mentor. But it's important to understand that. The tutor is really there to instruct. This is someone that it's like me for you guys right now. I'm a tutor. That's all I am. I'm presenting you with information, and you guys are taking it. A tutor will be someone that teaches you how to do this. It's like, all right, this guy showed me how to do an X lift with percutaneous screws. So they're mainly involved in coaching. They're mainly involved in teaching. Coaching is a little bit of a different relationship. These are people that are training you. They're actually the ones that are actually going to help you complete that lateral surgery safely. They're going to coach you through that. And once you've found a way to safely do that, that relationship basically ends, or just continues or metamorphosizes into something else. The coach will take as much time as necessary. So this could be a short limited for shorter things, but could take longer as well. But he cares that you advance as a surgeon and cares for the patients and their outcome. Their primary role, again, is training. The next one is a role model. And a role model is typically someone who will impart his influence and could be remote geographically. Todd is one of my mentors, and he has been really instrumental in helping me navigate my academic world and has become a wonderful friend. He lets me understand his 36,000-foot view and is a definite advocate of mine. But mentors are very meaningful. This relationship is very meaningful when you take it to the mentor level, which is the fourth level. Now, this is timeless. The mentor is going to assume all of the roles that we just talked about and beyond. These are surgeons that will likely not judge you ever. Their role is not to judge you, but to help you along the way. This guy on the top right is actually one of my patients, and he wrote a book and has helped me very much in my journey as a businessman, as a human being, on how to be a better guy. But I would also challenge you guys, as you seek out mentors, you also want to be a mentee. So you want to find a mentor and also be a mentee. So this is Ruan and he's my current fellow who came down from UC Davis. And I learned from him that I needed to just stop and listen for a little bit. And we actually kneeled outside of Scripps Clinic a little while ago for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, just taking a moment to reflect on all the social happenings around us this last couple weeks, and some of the terrible things that have been going on. And I think you have to find yourself. Sometimes I'm a mentor to Ruan, but on this day, Ruan became a mentor for me. And he took me on a journey that I needed to go on that I just didn't take enough time to do on my own. And for that, I'm forever grateful to Ruan for helping me with. You want to pay this forward. So as soon as you can, you want to find someone else that you can mentor along the way. And believe you me, these are the most meaningful relationships that will happen over the years. Albert Schweitzer kind of captured this as well. You must give some time to your fellow man, for remember, you don't live in a world all of your own. So you don't want to get too focused. You always want to, in my opinion, the altruistic part of it really is amazing. Using your talents, all this time and energy and education that you've had for something more meaningful is really, really powerful. And you want to build bridges, not walls. And you can do this across borders, as we've been able to do. And just to realize that relationships are really part of a meaningful relationship that will keep you from burning out and will keep you on a path to knowing yourself. So, as I mentioned, Global Spine Outreach is an organization that I now help lead. Our goal is to treat every child with severe spinal deformity, everyone that has a severe spinal deformity, to have access to life-transforming care. And it's been a joy to be a part of this group. I've developed many different mentors along the way, even in this environment, with a bunch of different surgeons that I've been able to operate with. We do so through symposia. We do that outside the operating room and then in the operating room. This is the case that Eric and I got to do when he came to Columbia with us as a severe deformity. As you can see here, this crazy view where you can just look right down the pipe of the vertebral body at the lower thoracic level, having 4 or 5 vertical segments here. This is what you look like on a CT scanner. It's what you look like in the operating room. An interesting thing is here I actually got to teach Dr. Kleinberg how to do surgery. He had never seen this before, so I had to teach him. And this is us in the operating room where he is masterfully learning from me. And he shows me his appreciation here in 1 second. And Erica, I very much appreciate you too. So you get to have a lot of fun. But more meaningfully is this is what happens afterwards. And, I think Eric would say that his time with us in Columbia was amazing. And I would certainly echo, he was an amazing surgeon to have there. And you do get to rediscover things about yourself that you may have lost along the way. You get to share your academic knowledge. So you get a lot of famous people to be with and to learn from. We get some not so young surgeons to be with as well. Eric, you're in that crowd now. We get different symposia that we work on. We eat tons of amazing food. And then again, getting to share in the clinical setting from masters like Dr. Akbarnia, teaching us about different aspects of this, different crazy pathologies that we're not accustomed to seeing at home. There's really no other opportunity in our career that connects us as surgeons in this way, where we can both teach and be taught at the same time. And I do still believe that active learning really is at its best in this environment. We brought live surgery to Mexico recently, and this is a live surgery that we performed, which we broadcasted, and here she is 18 hours post-op doing really well. Sometimes you have to do some crazy stuff. This is a patient that went into traction, but we didn't have any weight, so we set this traction contraption up with ID bags. On the other end, we used a shoulder holder to then loop the traction pins over. Sometimes you don't have the right number of screws or the right lengths, and so you have to cut them, and you got to be creative in how you do that. And it even goes to really cool things like getting donated magnetically controlled growing rods, where we can take these this type of technology overseas and then treat kids that have very treatable pathologies, just perhaps didn't have the technology to do it, and we can provide them with a sustainable way of doing this. And again, using your talents altruistically, in my opinion, is probably the greatest thing you can do. And operating with other people is probably one of the most delightful things that you will ever do in your career. And this is my wife. She's an amazing human being. She comes on a lot of these trips with us. This is when we were in Kenya, just praying over a kid and reigniting even our relationship and the love that we share for one another has been very, very much augmented on these trips. And getting back to the reason why it gets us back to the reason we all pursued this. None of us really went into this just to make money. We actually all went into it to have a more meaningful interaction with our families, with these kids and adults and just people that need our help. This is me with my family, taking them down to Mexico, doing these missions together as a family. It's cool for them to see their daddy and mommy in action. Of course, it's always nice to have someone put you back in your place. So I wanted to share a few books with you guys. I think these are really powerful books. One's called Essentialism. I would strongly recommend it. Another one that's really taken me on this pathway of getting to know myself is The One Thing. It's very basic concept of it forces you to stratify your life and what's important for you, and you focus on one thing at a time. And I could probably give a whole talk on this book, but it's really a very powerful book as you go into practice. I think would be very, very useful to you to get through. It's become a very popular book. Again, just get back to this outreach thing. There's nothing like these hugs that these families give you. These are kids that weren't going to get treated, whose hopes of having more productive lives would not be there if it were not for an organization like this. And to see your mentors interacting with families is really amazing. So global outreach it recenters you, restores your faith in your profession, allows for rapid generation of deeper friendships. It's always better to give back than is to receive, and try it. I promise you won't be disappointed. So satisfaction and joy in life was meant for all of us. It's not for the select few. And I challenge you guys for all of that. Take the time to invest in yourselves. Take the time to invest in others. At the end of the day, you got to have fun with what you're doing. So I appreciate you guys tagging on to this talk, and happy to entertain any questions.
Greg, amazing talk per usual. I'm going to give a couple minutes for people to ask some questions. I think we're gone over just a couple minutes, but I couldn't agree more that so I think that some of the professional relationships I've had and with you and certainly with the AO and the friends that we made have really been it's kind of the highlight of my professional career. And certainly I will never forget us operating together just because that was such a
It was awesome.
It was fun and terrifying and right all in the same breaths. So truly amazing. Do you have Greg? I don't know. We don't have too much time, so we'll see if there's maybe one or two questions. But is there, your first year in practice, all of these fellows are set to leave and go away next year. What's one active thing that they can do to help, center themselves? I think that's really what you're talking about in a lot of ways. Any one or two pieces of advice? I know you just give a huge talk on it, but what is one or two takeaways that they can really do?
Yeah, I think I think you have to spend a little bit of time truly mapping out who you are and what you want that to look like. And I mean literally mapping that out. I think if you have a visual or a written, whatever your method of learning is, of doing that, will help you achieve that goal. And the problem is so many of us think we go through these 4-year cycles of, undergrad residency, med school residency. It's just these cycles. All of a sudden you're a spine surgeon. You're like, okay, I'm done. Now what? Right? There's no more goal. So I think if you map out to say, what does my ideal life look like? It doesn't matter. Just write it down. Look what's the ideal look like. And then when you write that down, then you have to literally prioritize all those things that you put on that page. And you have to literally say, which one of those is the most important to me? And then in your first year in practice, focus on that one thing.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, and certainly if you don't plan it, life will plan it for you.
Mhm.
Right? That's I like the joke. How do you make God laugh? Tell him your plans. But if you have, but if you have no plans, then you're a bit aimless. And so I think it becomes important to figure out. Greg, why don't you, I'm going to have you share your email again, if you don't mind. Can you just tell us all your email again if people want to reach out to you and talk to you about global spine or mentorship and again,
Yeah.
special talk. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. It's a gmundus1@gmail.com.
g-1 at gmail.com. Thank you. And then we'll have that online. I think, Greg, we're over by just about 10 minutes.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's perfect. It's because I was talking and you were making too much fun of me. Let's let everyone get to their lives and their families. And thank you again. And thanks for being part of this symposium.
Of course.
See you, buddy.
All right. Bye-bye.